On the 30th of April 1945, inside of his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler would spend his final few hours with his wife Eva Braun, who he'd married the day before. He had dictated his last will and testament to his secretary Traudl Junge, and it was clear what he would do as the dictator of Nazi Germany realised that the war was lost. The truth of the matter was that the Red Army were encircling the bunker and the area around it, and that Berlin was being bombed to pieces by Soviet artillery. And it would only have been a matter of days before the Soviets would have found Hitler. He left specific instruction as to what should happen to his body, as days before he heard of Benito Mussolini's fate, as the executed dictator of Italy had his body strung up publicly in Milan. His remains were to be unceremoniously burned inside of the Reich Chancellery garden, just outside of the bunker's entrance. But there was a strange story of a funeral that took place for Hitler after World War II. But what is the story of this? Join us today as we look at this bizarre event, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Whenever a prominent Nazi died, Hitler's party made sure they gave them a huge funeral ceremony, which was all wrapped up in Nazi ideology and symbolism. For example, the funeral of the Butcher of Prague, Reinhard Heydrich, was a huge Nazi celebration, and Hitler himself even gave the eulogy. He said, and I quote, "I have only a few words." He was one of the best National Socialists, one of the strongest defenders of the German Reich idea, one of the biggest enemies of all the enemies of the Reich. He is a martyr. He died for the preservation and protection of the Reich. As leader of the party and leader of the German Reich, I award you, my dear comrade Heydrich, the highest award that I give you, the supreme rank of the Teutonic Order. After this, Heinrich Himmler went on to speak, and he said of Heydrich, "I have one last thing to say. You, Reinhard Heydrich, SS, were truly a good one. On a more personal level, I thank you for your unwavering loyalty and wonderful friendship, which united us in this life and death cannot obliterate it." But Adolf Hitler would get no such celebration of his life, as he spent the last few days of his life holed up inside of the Fuhrerbunker, and he had come to realise that the German war effort was over and that the war for the Nazis was lost, and that the Soviets would capture him if he did not take drastic action. The truth of the matter is that Hitler would have a rather strange ordeal following his death, after he was not necessarily given a funeral. However, his remains were dug up a number of times by the Soviets, it's believed. After his body was found inside of his study, it was rolled up in a rug by his valet Heinz Linger, and then along with Eva Braun's, it was taken up the stairs of the bunker, through the emergency exit, and into the garden behind the Reich Chancellery. The men who followed the body up the stairs, and would oversee the cremation of his remains, were Martin Bormann, his private secretary, Otto Gürnscher, Heinz Linger, Joseph Goebbels, his best friend and propaganda minister, Erich Kempka, Peter Hergel, Evald Lindlof, and Hans Reiser. A number of these were Hitler's private staff and those who remained very loyal to him. The body was placed in part of a bomb crater, and then it was covered in petrol to try and ignite it, but this at first did not work. Linger then went back into the bunker, and he came back with paper, which Bormann then lit and threw onto the bodies. This did work, and the group then all raised their arms, giving the Hitler salute, standing just inside of the bunker's doorway, as the remains of the Nazi dictator were engulfed in flames. But then minutes later, Heinz Linger ordered that the rug inside of Hitler's study, which was bloodstained, should also be burned. This was also taken into the garden and was then dealt with. This was the closest thing that Adolf Hitler had to any form of funeral, being cremated, but with his loyal friends and allies including Goebbels and Martin Bormann offering their dictator one final Hitler salute. They saw this as a fitting send-off for him, as the bombs and artillery still crashed all around Berlin. He was not given a coffin of any form or any box for his remains to be placed in, and was instead burned in the rug. Later the Soviets would claim that they did find his remains, but a few hours after the remains of Hitler were first ignited, more fuel was added, which reduced the remains to charred bones, and also a pile of ashes, which disintegrated when they were touched. Lindelof and Reiser, then in the evening, were dispatched to go outside again and cover up the ash remains inside of a shallow bomb crater, and they did this under intense heavy artillery shelling. But the remains of Hitler would undergo a strange and bizarre journey over the years. In early June 1945, the remains of several individuals, including Joseph Goebbels, were moved, and it was said that Hitler and Eva Braun's remains were also moved, but this is considered Soviet misinformation. There isn't a huge amount of evidence which suggests that Hitler or Eva Braun's remains were actually found by the Soviets. Only dental remains, which have been attributed to belonging to Hitler, do allegedly exist. But inside of one Belgian city, there was a bizarre celebration and funeral that took place for Hitler in a place where he and his army had caused so much suffering and horror. The Marolles District in Brussels in Belgium had a large Jewish population before the German army rampaged throughout the city in 1940. It's believed that there were around 4,000 Jews who were mainly refugees who scraped a living doing different jobs, but on one morning in 1942, the police rounded up 718 Jewish people, and most were then killed after being deported to the concentration camps. It's believed that around 660 of the 718 did not survive their deportations, being killed immediately. The Marolles district is also a place where there was a black market found during the war, which had a reputation of offering at high prices a number of products which were difficult to get hold of through, let's say, legal channels. However, because of the misery that the Germans had inflicted upon them, the people of the Marolles district decided to pay their own respects to the death of the Fuhrer. On the 10th of June 1945, they held a strange mock funeral for Adolf Hitler. The procession was witnessed by thousands of people, and the crowd was described to have been very wild. Today on a small street, the Rue de la Provoyance, there is a small plaque which marks the start of the funeral procession for Adolf Hitler. The funeral procession began at Combi Bar, but there was a coffin made for Hitler, which had an open top, and also this was placed on the back of an open-top truck. Some men dressed up in German-style uniforms to guard the body and remains, but of course Hitler was not in the coffin. The man playing the role of Hitler was a local volunteer named Philippe Lemaitre, and he was dressed in a suit, and he had even drawn on the Hitler moustache under his nose. The coffin was then carried throughout the streets of Marolles, and it was accompanied by fake German soldiers who formed a guard of honour. The coffin was decorated with funeral wreaths, and clergy and choir boys also sang as a procession made its way around the neighbourhood. But what is also incredibly interesting and strange is that the mock Hitler was also buried in this funeral. But it was a sign for many inside of this Belgian neighbourhood that the war was over, and it was their own way of celebrating the death of the dictator of Nazi Germany, who had caused so much pain and suffering. There was a huge celebration that accompanied the funeral, and some children were even photographed celebrating, and many people carried bottles of champagne to mark the occasion. For many people who witnessed the fake funeral of Adolf Hitler, it brought a humorous sense of closure to the suffering that they had had during the conflict. It was a strange sight for people to see, with Hitler being lowered into a grave inside of this Belgian city. However, there is still much debate today, decades after the war, about Hitler, his remains, and what truly occurred inside the Fuhrerbunker in the middle of Berlin as the Soviets encircled the city. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.